mic. Thank you all for coming again tonight. I appreciate it. So does the Q Plus ministry. We love the crowd. So here, I want to just do a couple of housekeeping things. We're going to have Colby talk for about an hour, and then we're going to do some Q&A. And when we do, we'll have a microphone, this one, that will come around. So because we are live streaming, we want to make sure the people at home can hear your question that Colby's answering. So if you'll wait to ask your question until AK gets to you with this microphone, that would be great. Bathrooms are across the hall. And if there are no further questions for me, I'm going to hand it over to Colby Martin.
No, you good. You keep that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Vicki. Hi, welcome to the presentation on the 1977 earthquake of Lisbon, Portugal. I am so glad that you're here tonight to talk about history's most devastating earthquake. This is, I assume, why you're here. Yes? Okay, so we didn't have Richter scales back in 1755, but if we did, the best estimates are that the earthquake of Lisbon, Portugal probably would have registered about a 9.0. Like, this was a devastating earthquake. Absolutely leveled the city of Lisbon. Estimates are some 100,000 lives are lost. The whole city was completely destroyed and had to be rebuilt. And one of the things that's interesting to me when I study the 1755 earthquake of Lisbon, Portugal, and that's actual footage, by the way, I don't know if you caught that, but is that as a result of this earthquake, in the aftermath of the devastation of this earthquake, multiple innovations across several fields emerged as a result of, or you could say, as a downstream effect from the earthquake. Meaning, were it not for the earthquake, it's possible that the following innovations might never have occurred, or at least would have been delayed for a time. So here's some of the innovations. After the earthquake, they began to ask questions such as, will my remote control work all night long? We'll find out. I'm going to move this over here just a little bit. So one question was, we need new infrastructure. As a result of this earthquake, we need new infrastructure. We need to rebuild this city. And so they started to ask questions like, well, how do we want to rebuild? If we have the chance now to start with a blank slate of land, how do we want to rebuild this city? And this actually led to the development of what nowadays we take for granted, certainly over here in America, take for granted as the grid style of city planning, but it was developed by the Marquis of Pombal and the resulting rebuild of Lisbon, Portugal in 1755 to build the streets with that sort of grid-style pattern. It also led to new technology insofar as they're like, well, can we build buildings that maybe can withstand future earthquakes? So maybe our buildings won't completely collapse and fall should this happen again. And so the earthquake led to this new kind of infrastructure. It also led to a new awareness of causality, which is to say, for the first time, they began to study what on earth literally is an earthquake. What causes it? Where did it come from? They began to ask questions they never asked before, like, did anybody notice the sea doing something before the earthquake? Were animals acting funny? Did the buildings fall in any particular way? And so this is the first time they began to study what causes an earthquake. It also led to new ideas of God. There was a rather popular saying around this time that goes like this: what is right. That was a shorthand way of saying what is, meaning whatever happens, whatever occurs, whatever unfolds in life is right, because it was believed that God causes all things to happen. So whatever happens is because God made it so, and therefore it's right. Well, what do you do on the other side of an earthquake that takes over 100,000 lives and completely levels an entire city? Can you continue saying what is right? Or does it cause you to then ask new questions to develop new ideas about how you think about God. There was, around Lisbon, Portugal, there was a significant Catholic influence, and after the earthquake, there were many in the Catholic Church that blamed the earthquake on the Protestants living in Lisbon, Portugal. I know, shocking. Like, that was the judgments of God. And now this next part's going to really shock you. There were Protestants outside of Lisbon, Portugal that blamed the Catholics for the reason why God sent this earthquake. And to both of those parties, history has the last laugh, because there was one part of the city that remained virtually untouched and survived, and it was the Alfama district, which was basically the red light district of Lisbon, Portugal. Yes, it would be like if something wiped out all of America, but Las Vegas remains. It's like, I don't know that that was really God then. But anyway, so new ideas about God. And then the fourth innovation was about language. The earthquake led to a need for new language. An example of this would be prior to the 1755 Lisbon, Portugal earthquake, a common metaphor when you wanted to describe something that was immovable, unshakable, you would say it is like the earth. It is immovable. It is unshakable. What do you do when suddenly the earth literally shakes? That no longer does that metaphor hold. And so it required a new kind of language on the other side of this earthquake. I start here because I think this is a pretty apt metaphor that might help describe some of you in this room tonight. And it certainly describes me, which I'll explain in a minute. It might describe some of you in this room tonight. By that I mean, perhaps you didn't have an earthquake in your life, but you might have had something kind of like a faithquake, where ideas that you once believed and held on to, something or some things happened to completely destroy it, upend it, annihilate it. Systems and institutions that you might have a history of relying on and feeling secure about and trusting in, as a result of some things in your life, now you look with suspicion or mistrust, or they've wounded you. Leaders of religions in the past, educators, pastors, priests, parents that you relied upon, now as a result of something in your faith journey has upended that and leveled that. And I think there's something that happens on the other side of a faithquake, where your faith can be said to have been leveled. There are also some innovations, you might say, that can happen on the other side of a faithquake that I think are pretty fascinating. So for instance, we can go back to the same four things that I referenced on the Lisbon earthquake, which is on the other side of a faithquake, we also are, by the way, the pink letters up there is we are ISO. Anybody know what that stands for? Okay, thank you. You are smarter than most crowds that I talk to. Okay. I probably should have changed that slide years ago because I always have to explain it, but ISO. We, on the other side of a faithquake, are in search of new infrastructure, which is to say, couldn't we rebuild, just like Lisbon rebuilt their city, getting to almost start from scratch and decide how do you want to do it differently this time, can we build a faith that, for example, might be able to withstand future faithquakes in ways where if things do happen in our life, if doubts come, if suffering strikes, if tragedy happens in our faith, we can withstand it a bit more. We're not going to be completely leveled or destroyed. Maybe on the other side of a faithquake, we also are in search of awareness of causality, which is to say, we ask questions like, how did this happen? What happened? Many people that I interact with, and this is certainly true for me as well, end up asking questions like, what happened to the Christianity that I used to know? Where did that go? How did I get here? Where I feel like I don't even recognize the tribe that raised me. So we're also in search of a new sense of causality. How did we get here? How did we get to a point where a segment of those who identify as Christian have more or less hijacked, certainly in our country, hijacked what Christianity is and represents. I mean, it's infuriating for many people, myself included. Like, that is not what Christianity is. And yet, we struggle to be heard over the noise of those who have the loudest platforms. Anyway, so we're also asking, how did we get here? How did this faithquake happen? And I think if you're here tonight, on some level, you know what I'm talking about. You have the kind of an open mind and an open heart, at least enough to say, yeah, I know what it's like to want to search for a new kind of faith on the other side of my faithquake. We also will look for new ideas of God. Many of us can remember times in our life, and I won't presume this is true for everybody, but I imagine most people can remember times in our life where we believed that God really only liked certain kinds of people. Certain denominations or certain religions or certain skin color or certain sexual orientation or certain gender. That was some of the ideas given to many of us by the religion of our youth. And now on the other side of our faithquake, we're asking, who do we understand God to be now? Who is God if not that God? And so many of us are here tonight with a more expanded view of who God is as a result of our faithquake or faithquakes for some of us. And then finally, we also find ourselves often needing to update our language on the other side of a faithquake. And certainly that is true for those who have been in the LGBTQ activist space or any work in that. You're constantly realizing that language needs to be updated. And the words we used to use maybe don't make sense anymore, or words that we didn't used to use, now we're using again. That's confusing. It's all part of it. It's fine. It all belongs. But the idea is that the faithquake gives us this invitation to be in search for new ways to talk about things. So with that said, what I want to share with you is a bit of my faithquake story to illustrate for you what I'm talking about, as well as to introduce myself a bit to you. And here's how I often like to start. I often like to say, hi, my name is Colby, and I'm a recovering Baptist. Thank you for having me here tonight. Yes, I see that hand. Thank you. So I was born and raised in small town Albany, Oregon, born to a dad who came from a long line of Baptists and Mennonites, and born to a mom who was a first-generation Christian, but when she found the church, she found the Baptist church. And so me and my two brothers, in the middle of three brothers, we grew up like any normal Baptist family, and we were in church about 47 times a week. This was just what you did as Baptists, and that was our life, and that was our rhythm. Our choir rehearsals and cantatas and Sunday schools and youth group and Awana. Gosh, I gotta love Awanas. And all of that got upended a bit around when I was age 8 or 9. I'm not entirely sure. My memory's a bit fuzzy from those years, but my parents started to separate, and there was a period of time where Dad was living with grandparents, but then he'd return, and then Mom was living with people from the church, and then she'd come back, and all the while, because we were good Baptists, they would assure us kids, don't worry, divorce is not on the table. And that was a couple years of time, and then eventually, around 10 years old, divorce was suddenly on the table. And so as a result of that, my mom was the one remaining in the Baptist church with her 3 sons, and I think she needed a fresh start. And also the Baptist church in the late 80s, early 90s didn't really know what to do with a divorced single mom, and it was just, everybody needed a new start. So my mom found a new church for us to go to, and it was just a generic evangelical Bible church, and we still continue to go to church, albeit not 47 times a week anymore, praise God. It was just like Sunday mornings, and Wednesday night youth group is 2 times a week. What an upgrade. And this is where I went to church all the way through middle school and high school. But it was really just something that I did because my mom made me. It wasn't something that I was all that interested in. Until the summer of 1999. Going into my senior year of high school. On that summer break, our youth group, our youth pastor, put together a trip to get in a church van and drive down the I-5, the Interstate 5 that runs all the way down from Seattle down to Mexico, and to drive down I-5 all the way to Southern California to take the youth group to an event called SEMP, S-E-M-P, which stands for Students Equipped to Minister to Peers. Because the only people who love acronyms more than the federal government are churches. I mean, we love our acronyms. And so the idea with SEMP was that high schoolers from all over the country would converge for a week and learn how to witness and how to share their faith to try to go back to school in the fall and save all of our friends. It's fine to laugh. It's a bit funny. So here's how that worked. So I remember the first day, Monday of SEMP. The morning times would be spent in rooms not too dissimilar to this, where there would be someone up front teaching us the art of apologetics. If you don't know what apologetics means, it's just a fancy religious word that means how to prove that I'm right and you're wrong. This is really all apologetics is. And they would train us in the morning, and then they would send us out to walk the sands of Huntington Beach, 2 by 2, because that's biblical. We would go out. And here's what we were trained to do. We would go like this. We'd walk up to random strangers and we'd say, hi, excuse me, sir. Can I ask you a question? Now, you should say no. Pull the ripcord and get out of there. Like, you do not engage is my recommendation to you. But you seem like a kind gentleman, so you probably say, yeah, sure. And so my question is this, and this is how we're trained. We say, if you were to die right now, great icebreaker. Sarah, if you want to design any sort of small group ministries or need icebreakers, that's a good one for you. If you were to die right now, do you know where you would go? Now, my hope is that he says no, because I can work with that. If he says yes, I'm like, all right, fine, moving on. But if he says no, we were trained. I don't know if some of you reacted when I said I come from the Baptist world, so some of you know how this works. But in the Baptist world, and much of evangelical Christianity, the idea is that if you can get someone to say the sinner's prayer, which is some version of confessing that you are a sinner, separated from God, and you deserve hell, but Jesus died on a cross, and if you invite him into your heart, then you'll be forgiven, and then you've got your name written in the book of life. And it's that easy. You say a prayer, say it after me, and you are saved. You're welcome. You're saved. And I get back to the room I'm staying in that first afternoon. 0% salvation rate, by the way. I didn't save anybody that day. So Billy Graham was in no threat to me coming up on his 6. But so I get back to my room that afternoon. And I lay down on the bed. And I just start weeping. Just sobbing. Which now in my life is not that big a deal. I'm kind of an easy cry now. But back then, I don't know if I'd ever really cried. Certainly not that intense. And I'm just soaking my pillowcase with snot and tears. And I will tell you the story as I experienced it then, and then as I talked about it for years afterwards. But I'm certainly at that point now that I talked about earlier where we need new language. Like, I would describe it differently now, in a sense, but this is how I experienced it in the moment, is I'm lying there crying on the bed, and I hear God say to me, not out loud, but in that way that you were like, oh, someone is talking to me. And God said to me, Colby, you have a choice to make right now. That's when I knew I wasn't a very good Baptist, because my God gave me choice. Thank you. All I need is one person to laugh at that joke, and I will sleep well tonight. Okay, I put that joke in this talk every time, and it rarely gets any reaction. It's just for me and the few people in the room that understand predestination and Baptist theology, and they think it's funny. Okay, moving on. The rest of you can maybe get that on the drive home. So God said to me, Colby, you have a choice to make right now. You can keep going on the path that you're on if you want. Totally up to you. And I knew what God meant. What God meant by that was I could keep making my life all about me, where I was the star character. Or God said, you can change right now in this moment. You can change. You can take a different path. And you can make your life about something different, something more. You can make your life about me and showing people my love and who I am. Fast forward years and years down the road, and I'm working with a spiritual director, and he's helping me piece together some of these important moments in my life. And what I realized what had happened in that moment on that bed is that I was completely cracked open by a sense of fraudulency, because I was out there on Huntington Beach trying to tell people how to have a relationship with God through Jesus when I didn't really have any clue what that meant for myself. I just knew the words to say. I didn't know what that. I didn't have any sense of that for me. I was a fraud out there, and that broke me. So God said, you can keep going if you want. You can just talk about it and be selfish and make your life about you, or you can make your life about me. And in that moment, I knew I want the second path. I want to make my life about being a conduit for the love of God. At the end of that week, there was a closing session, and I felt this call from God to go into ministry, to become a pastor. And so at the age 17, I felt called to be a pastor, and I got back from SIMP, and I canceled my enrollment for the Rochester Institute of Technology to study graphic design, and instead I enrolled at Western Baptist College to become a pastor. Not the best financial decision I've ever made, but I wouldn't change it for anything. And so I graduated from high school, I enrolled in college, and I got my degree, got my bachelor's in pastoral ministry, graduated with honors, and I was ready to go. I got my first job as an associate pastor at a church in Salem, Oregon, and I'm like, this is I could see the path in front of me. This is a world that makes sense to me. I'm good at it. It's well fit. I'm ready to go. And I'm about a year into this first job out of college. And I get to a point where I'm ready to become licensed in that particular denomination. That church was part of the Christian Missionary Alliance. I don't know if anybody knows the CMA. And so I wanted to get licensed so that I could officially marry my younger brother and his fiancée who were engaged. And so I began the process of getting licensed in the denomination. And the final step in this process is to sit on in front of a panel of seasoned ministers and answer their questions about the denomination, just to make sure that I was fit to be a pastor. Would have been fine, except for between that moment and my graduation, that year or so process after college, I had begun this process of auditing my faith. Here's what I mean by that. You know the game Jenga? Yeah, that super obnoxious game that you play once with your kids or your grandkids and the tower falls over and you're like, all right, we're doing something else. Like that is, the ROI on Jenga is very low. But in Jenga, you pull the blocks out of the tower and then you try to put it back up on top. But you got to twist it, turn it, and you're trying to not let the whole thing fall over. Okay. So I oftentimes think of auditing our faith like a Jenga tower, where each block represents a different belief, a belief that has been handed to us, that has been taught us, that we've inherited in some way. And after college, I began to, not really with any purpose or intention to audit my faith, but I began to read books by Christians that were not on the approved reading list of my Baptist professors. And this began to expand my mind to the reality that actually within Christianity for 2,000 years, there has been all sorts of people who have come to different conclusions about how to think about God and Jesus and the Bible and salvation and all that. Because I don't know if you know this about Baptists, but Baptists tend to think there was Jesus, then there was Peter, then there was Paul. Skip all this other stuff, doesn't matter. Then there's Baptists. Like this just pure unbroken line of truth and theology. And so I'm reading these books and I'm realizing, oh, there's different ways to think about these things. And I started asking questions that I'd never asked before. And so suddenly I'm taking these blocks of belief out of my Jenga tower of faith and I'm getting curious about them. And I realize sometimes with these blocks of belief, when you get curious about it and you ask questions of it and you study it in different ways, that sometimes you think to yourself, yeah, you know what, this is a belief I still want to hold, but so I'm going to put it back in my tower, but it's going to be a little bit different. I got to change it a little bit. And then other times, you look at these beliefs that you've held for a long time or that were given to you and you've never really considered them before, and you think, you know what, in good conscience, I can't believe this anymore. Let me get rid of the block. Like, this doesn't make sense anymore in line of what we know about the universe and the light of the relationships that I know and all of that. And then I think there are times where we kind of just put the block over here. Like, I don't know what to do with this. I can't necessarily add it back to my block, but I'm not really ready to get rid of it either. I'm going to set it right there. So back to this licensing process, about a year after college, getting ready for this final exam, if you will. And a couple of weeks before the exam, I'm studying on my lunch break at church, and I'm walking through the church lobby, reading the Policies and Procedures Manual for the Christian and Missionary Alliance. Riveting, absolutely. Trouble sleeping at night? Don't reach for melatonin. Reach for the Policies and Procedures Manual of the Christian Missionary. Anyway, and I'm reading some of the procedures, and I get to this line, and I'll never forget this. The line says, "Practicing homosexuals cannot be members of the church." I remember thinking, practicing? But what if they're like really good at it? Okay. Thank you. That's not what my first thought was. Practicing homosexuals cannot be members of the church. I remember thinking, okay, sure. I understand the correct theology. Being gay is a sin. Homosexuality is a disorder. It's not God's original design. Like, my mind knew the right theological answer. But for the first time in my life, I noticed that my heart was in a totally different place. And this was the first moment I realized that my head and my heart were not in alignment on this topic. This belief block that I had never gotten curious about before. Never had reason to, never had cause to. Suddenly, I'm like, wait a minute. Sure, I understand the theology, but you're telling me, this is the practical application of that belief? Can't be members of the church? That's absurd. And then I kept reading it. It outlined all they can't serve, they can't be a pastor, they can't be an elder, they can't serve in children's ministry. They're welcome to serve in parking lot attendants and greeters, and they're welcome to give of their tithes and offerings. Gosh, how generous. And that moment for me was one of those, okay, this block I'm taking out, I don't know what to do with, but I noticed this disconnect. And I wish I could tell you, so I used that moment to then really dive in and study and figure out what I believe, but that wasn't necessarily what my story was. I just kind of set that one over here, and I'm like, that's interesting. I'm not in the same place on that. After that moment, realizing my head and my heart were not aligned, I got a job opportunity at a large evangelical megachurch in Phoenix, Arizona. Don't recommend, by the way. Either the large evangelical megachurch or Phoenix, if I'm being honest with you. And so our family moves down there and working at this church, and I'm continuing this process of auditing my beliefs. I'm continuing this pursuit of what does my Christian faith look? What does my collection of beliefs actually look like? What do I think about all this stuff? And I'm continuing to read and get curious and to study. And there came a moment where, and I don't know necessarily, I can't remember what caused me to go back and revisit that moment in the church lobby and pick up that Jenga block of belief, but something around 2009 or 10 caused me to be like, all right, I'm finally going to look into this. I'm finally going to try to align my head and my heart. I can't really live in this tension of being unaligned any longer. And so I gave myself permission to study the clobber passages. And the clobber passages, I'm sure you're familiar with, these are the 6 or so pesky, obnoxious verses that historically have been used, I would argue misused, to justify discrimination against those who identify as LGBTQ. So I gave myself permission to just dive into the clobber passages using all of the tools of the trade. Everything that I've been trained to do in my education, everything that I've been modeled for by my professors and my pastors before me, which is, by the way, what drives evangelical people nuts. It's like, look, I'm just doing what you taught me to do. You just don't like my conclusions, but I'm doing it correct, or how you showed me. So I gave myself permission to dive into the clobber passages and figure out how to line these two up. And I didn't know how that process was going to end up, by the way. I was prepared for the possibility that I would look into these 6 verses and get to the other side and be like, well, I kind of do think that is what the Bible teaches. So sorry, heart, but you got to figure out how to get in line. Which, by the way, you know of course you do, the phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin? Yeah. In my new book, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, but I've got a chapter about that phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin. And I do think there's a sense in which, for most people who use that as their descriptor for their posture towards LGBTQ people, it is their way to describe that sort of sorry heart, but you got to get in line. Like, it's such a commitment to a particular worldview, and yet in their heart they do have a kind of love, and so they're like, I don't know, I think that might be where that comes from, what drives that. We can talk more about that later if you want. But so I dove into the study of the clobber passages, and spoiler alert, came out on the other side, convinced that we had gotten it wrong. The church has gotten it wrong. And so I became fully affirming. And thankfully, it was my heart that was actually leading the way, and my head that got to line up with my heart. And so I became fully affirming about the year 2010 or so. And I would love to tell you that I showed up at church the next Sunday and said, hey, everyone, I've got something I'd like to share with you. I didn't do that. I was working at a church in which I had a sense that maybe that wouldn't be welcome. See the aforementioned description of evangelical in Phoenix, Arizona. And so I lived for a time where, yes, I had aligned my head and my heart, and that alignment was good and whole and beautiful. But now I entered this new stage of lack of alignment, because now my internal reality no longer matched with my external reality. My internal convictions were mismatched with my external reality. In the book on Clobber, if you've read it, you might remember that part of the story, and I describe the Naaman effect. And the Naaman effect is what is taken from this story in 2 Kings chapter 5, where Naaman is a non-Jewish, a pagan person a general who gets a skin disease, and he hears about this healer named Elisha in Israel, and so he goes and he asks Elisha for healing, and Elisha tells him to dip in the Jordan, I think like 7 times or something, and Naaman gets healed, and as a result of that process, he is essentially converted. He says, okay, I now understand that the best God is over here in Israel, to your God. Yahweh is my new number one. He's my new homie. That's the Hebrew. Trust me. He's my new homie. But Naaman says to Elisha, I know that if I go back to my homeland, inevitably I'm going to have to enter the temple of my people's gods, and I'm going to have to serve my master while we worship this pagan God. What do I do? Because I know now that's not the best God. Yahweh is. And Elisha says, well, Naaman, if you want to be a man of honor and integrity and conviction, then you need to return back home, and you need to announce to everybody that you have now followed and converted to Yahweh. That is not what Elisha says. Actually, it's the opposite. Elisha says, Naaman, go in peace. And when you read the story, what you understand Elisha's doing is he's saying, go back to your hometown and receive permission to just keep that in here, knowing that if you go back and start broadcasting it, your head's going to get chopped off, and that's not going to do your family or anybody any good. It's a fascinating story, and for a while it gave me this divine permission from God to be like, okay, mismatch between internal convictions and external reality, I can live with that. I can do that. But I'm not convinced the Naaman effect is intended for a long duration of time, because I think the human spirit longs for integration. The human spirit wants to be whole and aligned. And so there came this moment where the more I reflect on what happened next, the more I wonder if my internal self sabotaged things to just force that alignment, because I was not acting quickly enough in that process. And the inciting incident would be September 20th, 2011, when President Obama signed the repeal for Don't Ask, Don't Tell. You may remember this was the military ban against openly gay and lesbian service members. And I remember that night, it was a Tuesday night, I remember reading about the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And at this point, I'm incredibly ignorant / naive on most things politics. I was pretty naive. In my mind, I'm like, oh, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that seems like a discriminatory policy. So repealing that, that's a good thing. And at our church, one of our slogans, one of our mottos is, in the kingdom of God, there's no room for discrimination. Turns out there was an asterisk I never bothered to read. But I'm like, okay, Don't Ask, Don't Tell is a discriminatory policy, so this is great. I assumed Christians throughout the land would also be welcoming the repeal. Okay, so that night, before I go to bed, I do the thing that honestly most wise, grounded, mature, evolved adults do whenever they want to engage with politics. I went to Facebook and I shared an article announcing the repeal, and I put 6 words of my own. I put, "I'm glad this day finally came." I clicked post. I went to sleep. Woke up the next morning to an inordinately large number, the red notification bubble next to that blue F on my phone. I'm like, that's a high number. What's going on? And I open up my Facebook, and you can probably imagine the kinds of comments that were filling my Facebook post. Comments like, wait, so is our church now pro-homosexual? Comments like, why is our pastor advocating for the gay agenda? The gay agenda. Whoa. By the way, I've been an ally for like 15 years now. Still do not have my copy of the gay agenda. So if anybody knows where they keep these things, I'd love to know what it is. And so I get to the office later that day, and my boss calls me in. He says, "Colby, my phone has been blown up all night. People are freaking out over your post. I need you to take it down. You're being divisive." Divisive. Nobody wants to be divisive in the church. And so I'm like, okay, I don't want to cause a ruckus. Now I don't care about causing ruckuses, obviously. But back then, when I was the only one working in our home and we had 3.5 children, it was like we had to pay a mortgage and feed the kids. And so I'm like, okay, let me take the Facebook post down. I thought that was the end of it. And then I find out that come Friday, an emergency board meeting was scheduled to deal with the situation. And if you've ever served on a board, then you know that the absolute best word to go in front of board meeting is canceled. Am I right? Is there anything better than a canceled board meeting? Oh, I got my night back. Okay, but the worst word to go in front of board meeting is emergency. Yeah, especially if you're the cause of said emergency. And so I spend all day Wednesday and Thursday getting ready for this Friday meeting, knowing that I would be summoned into a room to give an account for my views on sexuality. And I knew going into that meeting that I could no longer sustain and no longer wanted to sustain this disconnect between my internal convictions and my external world. I knew that come what may, it was time for me to be open and honest about my convictions fully. And so I spent all day Wednesday and Thursday working on a letter, because I figure out what I think and believe by writing. And I also knew that if I showed up into that meeting and just tried to answer their questions extemporaneously, that there was a possibility that the fear would overwhelm me and I would find a way to kind of soft pedal and semi-answer their questions and kind of, get out of it. And I didn't want to do that. So I came prepared with a 10-page letter. I basically killed a small bush in the effort to do this. And I showed up with 10 copies of this 10-page letter, and I sit down in that room filled with 9 other men, which was redundant. I told you it was an evangelical megachurch. You knew who was in the room. So sit down. By the way, I can take shots at evangelicals. They're my people. Sit down with 9 other men, and second I sit down, the chair of the board says, Colby, we need to know your views on sexuality, and we need to know your belief on same-sex marriage. And I looked at him and I said, it's really that important to you to know just the ideas that are up here? Is that what you're telling me? Because it's not like I was out there teaching about it. I wish I was. It's not that I was out there preaching about it. I wish I was. I just had the ideas up here. Like, it's really that important that you know. And he said, yes. And then I looked each man in the eye. I'm like, all of you, it's that important. And they're like, yes. I'm like, all right. Well, good news. And I pulled out my stack of letters, and I passed them around to the room. And I said, I'd like to read this letter for you. Don't flip to the end. Just let me read it. And I shared about my time doing ministry with each of the men, and the mission trips that we went on, and the way our families did barbecues together, and the worship ministry that we built together, and talked about the work of all of the overlap of our visions and our hearts for ministry and for the kingdom of God. And then I did get into a little bit of the clobber passages and shared a little bit of, this is actually what I think the Bible is saying. And then at the end, I came out of the theological closet and I said, yes, I fully affirm those who identify as LGBTQ. And yes, of course, I would be okay for two people of the same sex to get married. And they asked a few follow-up questions. Honestly, they didn't show a ton of curiosity. Yeah, shocking. I know. I'm like, what? They said, Colby, why don't you take the weekend off. We'll fill your role on Sunday while we take a couple days to deliberate this. So I didn't go to church that Sunday. And then when I showed up at the office Monday morning, I get called into my boss's office and he hands me a letter of termination, effective immediately. And if the auditing of my Jenga tower of beliefs the previous 5-6 years were the slow tremors leading up to September 26th of 2011, that moment of getting that letter of termination was like the final quake of my faith quake. It was the final nail in the coffin of my evangelical journey. Like I knew, like, oh, I don't have people anymore. I don't have a tribe anymore. I had a suspicion it was already going that way, but like this was the final. Like, you do not qualify to be a pastor here anymore because of ideas in your head. I remember that season clearly being some of the darkest days of my life up to that point, and questioning if maybe I had misunderstood God back when I was 17 years old. Like, maybe I wasn't called to be a pastor. Or maybe the first group that licensed me to become a minister, maybe they were wrong. Maybe I'm not fit to be a pastor after all. In my book on Clobber, which I'll pause to say half of the book does show my research on the Clobber passages and why it is that I think we've gotten the Bible wrong. And the other half of the book tells a bit of a story that I've shared with you tonight. But there's a moment in the book where I'm talking about getting fired and wondering if I really wasn't meant to be a pastor after all. Because at that time, I didn't know about so much of the world of inclusive and affirming churches that already existed out there. I was a sweet, naive little evangelical boy, and I'm like, that's it. I can't be a pastor and be affirming. And currently, actually, I don't know how many of you here are part of St. Paul's, but you might be delighted to know that I'm about a year into the ordination process to become an Episcopal priest. So so that'll be my second act, if you will, once assuming that process goes through. But about 6 months ago, I'm meeting with the Commission on Ministry, and there's like 15 Episcopal priests in the Diocese of San Diego that's sponsoring my ordination on my computer screen. And Bishop Susan, she unmutes, and she's like, Colby, I have a question for you. She says, on page 127 of Unclobber, I'm like, that's weird, where's this going? She says, when you describe that you had just gotten fired and you were unsure if you could ever be a pastor again, you write this, and then she quotes, you write, I mean, what am I going to do? Become an Episcopal priest? I wrote that 10 years ago. Ah, what a delight. I did not even remember that I wrote that, and it was so fun. So she's like, so tell me about that. So I'm like, well, I guess God's got a sense of humor. So I get fired, and I think, okay, this is it for me. But then I found this church in San Diego, and I started to discover the world of progressive Christianity. I need to hurry this up. I entered the world of progressive Christianity, and I began to learn about Presbyterians and Lutherans and Episcopals, people that had been doing this kind of open and affirming work for a really long time. And so I got connected to the church in San Diego, worked there for a couple years, total dumpster fire of a situation. Don't worry about it. No follow-up questions are needed there. But out of the dumpster fire of that church, out of the ashes of that, we had built some really beautiful relationships with people in the community, so that when that didn't work out, the people said, look, you are our pastor. If you will stay in San Diego and start something, we will help support you. And so that led to the starting of a church in San Diego called Sojourn Grace Collective. We ran that for about 9 years. We ended up closing that, by the way, back. If you only know me from the book, for what it's worth, my life is very different now. That was 10 years ago. Lots of things have changed, including the fact that Sojourn, the church that we started, we closed that in 2022. We tried to come back from COVID a couple times, and ultimately it was clear to us that that had run its course. Incredible ministry. Hundreds of lives were changed and impacted and transformed. Loved it. But that was my season of life where I'm in this world of progressive Christianity that led to, wrote the book on Clobber, which I shared a bit about already, planted Sojourn Grace Collective, and now I have been, I should say 15 years, I need to redo this slide, but 15 years now of doing this work of what brings me to here tonight, to this moment with you. Where my assumption is that you have heard it said that you cannot be both gay and Christian. Or perhaps you have heard it said that the Bible condemns homosexuality. Or perhaps you have heard it said that Christians can't affirm LGBTQ people, that this is an oxymoron. But I say to you that I actually think LGBTQ affirming Christianity just makes sense. That's my time. Thank you, everybody. Good night. Just imagine, that's it. just make the statement and then leave. So let me explain a little bit of this for the rest of our time tonight. I've got three claims that I want to make really quick. And the first claim is this, that the Bible has nothing to say about homosexuality. The Bible has nothing to say about homosexuality. Honestly, any suggestion that the Bible condemns homosexuality, for me, is obviously and undeniably false. This is what I mean by that. The term homosexuality is a very modern term. It's a very modern category. It is a very modern way to frame sexual orientation, which is in and of itself also very modern. We're talking less than 200 years old. Does the concept of sexual orientation even exist? And sexual orientation, as best as we talk about it today, and there may come a time where we need to update our language for how we talk about it, but as best as we understand sexual orientation, which is a fairly new in human history concept, sexual orientation is simply naming that all humans, we are born, and through some mysterious cocktail of nature and nurture, we don't really know how these two work together. Any attempt to say it's all nature or all nurture have just been met with kind of resounding, like, well, that road didn't go anywhere. So it's some, combination of nature and nurture. All humans develop a sort of innate desire and attraction towards members of blank. Most of human population have innate desires and attractions for members of the opposite sex. This is hetero, different sexuality. And then, of course, there are a smaller percentage of those who experience innate desires and attractions towards members of the same sex. This is homo, meaning same, sexual. And then there are those who are somewhere in between. We have the Kinsey scale, which is a way to name that there are people who are sort of somewhere in between these two poles. But this concept of sexual orientation is a relatively new phenomenon, and homosexuality is an even newer concept. My point in saying this is to say that the Bible has anything to say about homosexuality makes about as much sense as saying, what is a biblical principle on whether or not I should invest in crypto? We're asking the Bible to answer modern questions about categories that were not available to the authors of Scripture. This is why I just start by saying any claim that the Bible has anything to say, positive or negative, about homosexuality and orientation is just categorically false, because this is a modern concept that the Bible does not, and actually could not, even if it wanted to, have anything to say about. Claim number 2, however, doesn't the Bible have something about, same-sex sex? Yes, this is what was referred to earlier as the clobber passages. So claim number 2 is the Bible does not provide a blanket condemnation against any and all same-sex sex acts. So obviously the Bible does have some references. So what do we do with that? And these are the clobber passages, which we're not going to go through tonight, otherwise you wouldn't buy the book. No, but also because I know a lot of you already have it. It's just not what we're here for. This would take a whole lot more time. But you've got Genesis 19 that traditionally is about, people say God destroyed the cities because of homosexuality. But a faithful reading for me is that the story is this ancient story that was passed on as a reminder for Israel to be people of hospitality. You've got Leviticus, which a traditional reading is that anytime a man has sex with a man, that's an abomination. But I think a more faithful reading is that this was a culturally forbidden. It was culturally forbidden for married men. This is specifically a prohibition for married men to have sex with anyone other than his wife. If you read Leviticus 18, you read all of the different women in a man's life that he can't have sex with. And this should not surprise all of the loopholes that need to be closed. Nope, not your stepmom, not your aunt, not your sister-in-law. Like, you just read all of these, it's like, nope, 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 nope. And then it just gets to one verse, it's like, oh, and also don't have sex with the man, the kind of sex that you have with your wife, is my reading of it. Romans 1, which is my favorite clobber passages. I don't know if you can have favorites, but I do. This is the one that for me was the hardest to, it was the one I saved for the last when I did my study on these passages, because I was the most intimidated by it. But now it's like my favorite to teach, because I actually think a faithful reading shows that what Paul was trying to do with his letter to the church to Rome was to bring together these groups that have been fractured along ethnic lines, Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, and Paul's like, I need you to work it out, to find harmony, to live in peace with one another. And his move to do that in the opening chapter of Romans is to expose the deep prejudices held within the Jewish people's hearts against the Gentiles, and say, okay, that judgmental attitude that you have towards them, that's actually the problem here. That's the thing that's going to threaten to undo this whole project. We got to get rid of that. And the clobber passage is nestled inside of that larger rhetorical framework. And then the other two clobber passages in 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1, traditionally that's where people say, oh, see, you can't be gay and Christian. But I think a faithful reading is, well, Paul was describing a very specific kind of sex acts between two men in which there was either exploitation and or monetary transaction happening. And he was saying that kind of sex is not compatible with the kingdom of God, which you could also argue was the only conception that Paul had, or any of them had at that time, for gay relationships. There was no such thing as a relationship between people of the same sex where they were equal, where it was consensual. There just wasn't a thing back then. Their only conception for it was exploitation or imbalances and transactional. And so Paul's like, that sort of arrangement is not compatible with the kingdom of God, which I argue in the book is the same for us straight folks too. Like, also, like we can have expectations for all people that look the same. We don't have to have like special categories for, here's the rules for straight people, here's the rules for gay people. No, we can just all be like, hey, don't exploit people. How about that? Anyway, that's the clobber passages. The Bible has not been told what we've always been said that it says. So then that leads me to say this. Okay, well, if we can reasonably say that the Bible Doesn't have anything to say about homosexuality, and I think that one is just easy. There should be no pushback there. And nor does it speak against loving, mutually honoring relationship between two people of the same sex. Is there something we can get from Scripture? If we know what it doesn't say, well, what does it say? And this leads me into a little bit of the material that's going to come up in my book that comes out later this year. So back on the table there, I've got both of my books that are already published on Clobber, which many of you already have, and a book called The Shift, which The Shift is like a survival guide for becoming a progressive Christian. The subtitle is Surviving and Thriving After Moving from Conservative to Progressive Christianity. It's my work over the past decade plus of helping people who have either left their more conservative communities or been kicked out of them, and they know they want to stay Christian because something about the story of Jesus still means something to them, but they know it's got to be more open, more expansive, more progressive, more inclusive. And so like, well, what do I do with God? What do I do with the Bible? What do I do about Jesus? What do I do about the people in my life who are concerned about me? How do I rebuild this faith? And so that's what The Shift is about. And then my new book, which comes out November 17th, and there's QR codes back there that you can scan to pre-order, is a follow-up to Unclobber. Because Unclobber has a very narrow scope, which is to say it really only deals with the 6 Clobber passages. And for many people, that's enough. That's sufficient. They just need to know, how do I deal with these 6 verses? Oh, okay, that makes sense. I'm affirming, good to go. As I've been doing this work now for over 10 years, I have learned that other people have reasonable follow-up questions. Okay, I hear you, but what about Adam and Eve? But what about God making 2 genders? But what about biblical marriage? But what about stories of ex-gay people? But what about love the sinner, hate the sin? And these are the but what abouts that the questions that hold people back from full inclusion beyond the Clobber passage. And so my new book is called But What About? The most asked questions on faith, the Bible, and LGBTQ inclusion. And what I'm going to share with you is a little bit of what comes up in the second half of the book, which I think is actually the best part of the book. And these are my questions for consideration. But what about, and so here's what we're going to get into. Where'd my remote go? Great. Thank you for holding on to it for me, Vicki. Claim number 3 is, I think the Bible points to inclusion and affirmation as the logical extension of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. I think we can look for the patterns, I think we can follow the trajectory, and we can pay attention to what matters most, and it will lead us to full affirmation. 3 quick stories from the scriptures. Story number 1 is Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, the earth was shapeless, without form, and darkness hovered over the deep, and into the darkness God spoke and said, "Let there be." And there was light, and God called it good. But like, why? I mean, have you ever just stopped to think, well, what's so good about light? Now, I understand the obvious, immediate response is, oh, well, light is how you see things. Okay. But if we're just saying that God calls the addition of light good because light is inherently good, then that implies that darkness is bad. And I do not think we want to set ourselves on a line of thinking where we see lightness as good and darkness as bad. Nope, I don't want anything to do with that. Plus, we can't just say that light is good because light lets you see when you do realize that you are equally blinded in pure light as you are in pure dark. So it can't just be that light is good because light is inherently good. This is not why God calls it good. I submit to you that the reason why God called it good when light was added into dark is because you need both of them to create contrast. And when you have contrast, then you can see what previously was hidden. But you need both. Okay, Genesis chapter 1. Go forward 10 chapters later to Genesis chapter 11. The storyteller says that at that time, everyone on the earth spoke one language and had one tongue. And in the Hebrew there, it's basically saying they said the same kind of words, they spoke the same, and they had the same meaning. In other words, everybody looked the same, talked the same, think the same. And the people said, well, let's let's build a city for ourselves. Let's build a city and make a name for ourselves. We could even make a tower in the middle of the city up to the heavens, and we can really do something special. And so they use this new brick-making technology to build this tower. Again, found some real footage there of the building. And so they build this tower into the heavens, and the storyteller says that God looks at what's going on, and God says, uh-oh, they might actually pull this off. That's not good. Now, if you or anything like me, you grew up hearing the story of the Tower of Babel as a story about pride. And God looking at humans who, in their pride, tried to build a tower to the heavens. And now I'm looking at the story in that framework, and I'm like, and what's the assumption here? That God looks at what humans are doing and is like, no, only I can live in heaven. I mean, is this a story where God's ego gets bruised? And look, if your God has a fragile ego that can get bruised by the building of a tower, get a better God, okay? This is not a story about God being offended by humans building a tower. No, God looks at this construction of the tower and says, uh-oh, they might pull this off, and that's not good for them. Here's why. Or here's what I get out of this story. A number of years ago, I read a book called Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, one of the best books I've read in the last 15 years. And it's a brief history of, or it's a brief overview of the history of Homo sapiens, our species, and where we came from. And there's a section in there where he talks about our ancestors, the transition from when we were roaming band of hunter-gatherers to then settle down and became city people. And we call this the agricultural revolution. This is when our ancestors tamed the seed and tamed the beast. And we could stay in one spot now and plant crops and raise cattle. And it changed us from being rovers to then being city dwellers. And Yuval Noah Harari calls this history's biggest fraud. The promise was, you can now grow your own food and you can now build bigger cities. And yes, in theory, that did actually work. Cities, population boomed, and cities grew larger, but then it introduced all sorts of new complications. All sorts of new diseases started to crop up because there was too many people living in proximity to each other. All sorts of diseases came onto the scene because we used to have diets that were diverse with all sorts of different nutrients and vitamins from a diet that was, we would trace around and have diversity in our diet, but now it's just all grain, and so our body started to get new diseases and introduce new categories of haves and have-nots, because now if I can store all my own food, I can have more than you, and now I got to protect what I have and maybe even try to steal what you have, and so it introduced all sorts of problems in our ancestors' history. Okay. I read that years ago, and my mind went straight to the Tower of Babel, because here's a story where everybody on earth looked the same, talked the same, thought the same. And they build for themselves this massive city. And God says, oh no, you might actually pull this off, and that's not good for you. And so what does the storyteller say God does? Splits everyone up, spreads them all over, and into a moment of complete uniformity, God introduces difference and scatters them. Okay, then the third story goes into Acts chapter 2. This is the New Testament. This is the story of Pentecost. This is where the church really gets its catalyzing moment. The early followers of Jesus just went through this roller coaster of their leader dying on a cross, and then coming back from the dead, and then disappearing into the clouds is weird. And now it's Pentecost, and they're all gathered together, and they're like, well, what are we going to do? What would it look like for us to keep being people who follow in the way that our rabbi, our Messiah, taught us? And when you read this story in Acts chapter 2, you have this room filled of relatively like-minded and certainly like-tongued people. And as they start to pray, Luke, the author of Acts, describes it as though these tongues of fire began to alight on people. And once again, the Spirit of God, like in Genesis 1, hovers over, tongues of fire, which later you got to imagine, like, how many different metaphors did Luke go through before he landed on tongues of fire? Like, that's weird, but that's what we have to work with. I'm sure he's having a good laugh on that. And if you remember the story, people outside the gathering started to huddle around and they say, what is going on? Because we know everybody in that room. We know they're all from Galilee. We know they all speak the same language. Except for I'm from Egypt and I hear it in my tongue. Wait, you hear it in your tongue? Because I'm from Midian and I hear it in my tongue. Wait, you hear it in your language? And like 12 different languages in the story are represented as understanding what was happening in their own native language. It would have been a different miracle if they all would have understood the one Galilean language. This is not what the miracle is. The miracle is they hear it in their own tongue, and they turn to each other and they say, what does this mean? I submit to you that possibly what this means is the Spirit of God. She looks at this moment where the church is about ready to be born, and she says, you know what we're not going to do? We're not going to do one more human institution where everybody looks the same, thinks the same, talks the same, not on my watch. And into this moment of sameness, the Spirit of God introduces difference. I put all three of these stories together, and I step back and I look at from the beginning to the end, and I cannot help but notice that there seems to exist a divine preference for diversity. There seems to exist a divine preference for diversity. That anytime you see the path of sameness, uniformity, conformity, this, my friends, is the path of empire. Empire loves when everybody gets in line and looks the same. This is stormtroopers. I mean, you can do great things when you get everybody to fall in line. You can build towers that reach to the heaven. You can build Death Stars that take out planets. Empire loves uniformity. The kingdom of God goes in the complete opposite direction. Diversity, plurality, difference. When you keep reading in the book of Acts, you see that there is a trajectory, not only starting in the Old Testament, but just ramps up in the New Testament, in the book of Acts. That the trajectory in Scripture is of increased inclusion, of a widening of God's mercy. You read as the story of Acts unfolds, and not only is there this moment in Acts chapter 2, but then you have in Acts chapter 8, the baptizing of an Ethiopian eunuch. And that is a wild story for a number of reasons. Not least of which, a eunuch for the Jewish people was their version of a sexual other. They were perpetually on the outside, unclean because of their state. And yet, here is this story preserved for us. One of the first people baptized into the church is this foreigner who's a eunuch, with no words of condemnation, no sense of fixing them. There was nothing to be fixed. It was like, oh, well, I guess you're part of the family of God too. And then it gets even crazier than that. A couple chapters later, in Acts chapter 10, you have this vision Peter receives of these unclean animals where God tells him to eat. And he's like, God, I've never eaten unclean things. And there's this whole moment that leads him to then go to a Gentile named Cornelius' house. And he realizes, wait a minute, the Spirit of God is at work in the Gentile people too. And Peter has this radical moment where he says, I'm learning that I must never call another human unclean. How have we done with that, church? For 2,000 years, how have we done with that? I am learning I must never call another human unclean. It is right there in like the very beginning of our movement. This awareness that, wait a minute, either everybody's in or nobody's in. Like there's no other option here. So this trajectory of inclusion is all throughout the scriptures. Okay, so this leads me to then say, because I do want to get to some questions here. This leads me to say this, that I'll briefly say I've talked a bit about what the Bible doesn't say, what the Bible does say for LGBTQ affirmation and inclusion, but my main contention is that LGBTQ affirming Christianity makes sense. So let me say quickly a word about the Christian part of that thesis. This sentence here, what does it mean to be a Christian, can be broken up into two different ways. What does it mean to be Christian in the verb sense? What does it mean to be a Christian in the noun sense? And I think breaking the question down like this is very helpful. What does it mean to be a Christian? That's a sense of identity. What does it mean to be Christian? Now we're talking about behavior. Identity and behavior. And again, I talk about this in my new book. Identity and behavior there is a spectrum in which these things, how tightly they're connected. Here's what I mean. In some instances, identity and behavior, there's a strict connection, which is to say you don't get the identity without the accompanying behavior. An example would be to be a vegan. You don't get to call yourself a vegan if you're eating cheeseburgers every Tuesday night. You have to do the thing. A pacifist. You don't get to be called a pacifist if you're out there just punching people. So there's a strict connection between identity and behavior. And then, on the other end of the spectrum, there's a real loose connection. Identity and behavior. That might be an example of a sports fan. You could take the identity of a sports fan. I'm a Razorback fan. What is the required behavior? Actually, y'all might have some required behaviors in that. Maybe I shouldn't have asked that. But more or less, you can see how you can call yourself a thing, but really, there's no annual dues you got to pay to be a fan. There's no specific things you have to wear. There's no required behaviors. I believe that when you read the book of Acts, that when you notice that the first Christians were called followers of the way, they were called that by outside observers who watched them live their lives differently, who saw the behavior, saw the way they treated people, and called them followers of the way. That's about how they lived. Which is to say that in the very beginning of our religion, identity and behavior was strictly connected. You didn't get to be called one without the behavior, because that's how you got called it. And now, people just can and do call themselves a Christian without any receipts to back it up. There's almost no connection anymore between identity and behavior. So I'm far more interested not in being a Christian. I don't know, be a Christian or not. Take the identity or don't. It's far less interesting to me. It's usually about beliefs, and beliefs come and go. What does it mean to be a Christian? I don't know, pick a denomination. They'll tell you their own specific beliefs on what it is. Less interested in being a Christian. Far more interested in what does it mean to be Christian. Now we're talking, because now we're saying, you actually have to live your life in a way that reflects Jesus. You have to actually live in a way where forgiveness is better than revenge. You have to actually live in a way where you desire mercy and not sacrifice. You actually have to care for the outsider. Being Christian, I think, is far more important and far more interesting and far more what's at stake. So where does this leave us? In summary, when you consider that there's no justification to be anti-LGBTQ, and when you consider that the Bible presents this divine preference for diversity and shows us this ever-widening inclusive trajectory, and when you consider that being Christian means to follow in the way of Jesus, rooted in this radical call to love, then that is why I say not only is it not an oxymoron to be a Christian and to be affirming, but I actually think being a Christian who affirms LGBTQ people just makes sense. Amen?
Amen.
Amen. Okay, so that's my time. That's my presentation. This is where, if you wanted to, you could clap. Oh, shoot. No, thank you. No, please stop. No, that's just, thank you. Honestly, that just gives us a sense of finality. I don't need the applause. But I just wanted to do the transition now into question time, because I'd love to know what your thoughts are, what has come up for you, and the microphone will get passed around. And usually in this moment, we need somebody who will give the rest of us the gift of going second, which means you have the courage of going first. And I'm just curious, what came up for you? What thoughts do you have? Where are you at in all this?
That was quite a hike. I just want to say thank you for using the word hijacked earlier in your speech. I grew up in a very conservative church, and I rejected it around the age of 12, mostly because I was a feminist, and even though I didn't have the word ally back then, I was very sympathetic for people who were gay, and I didn't like what our church was saying about that. Mm-hmm. And I stayed out of church for about 20 years because I had no idea that you could be Christian and be liberal. Yeah. And I didn't find that out until I started dating my husband, who's Episcopalian.
Hey.
And so I just want to say thank you for that. I think
Yeah.
a lot of people don't realize, like, how much spiritual conflict you can go through when you feel like you have to choose between your spiritual beliefs and your, say, political or social ones.
Yeah.
And I at 12 was like, yeah, social every time, you know. And it took me a long time to realize that you can have both,
Yeah.
and that it's okay to have both. So thank you.
Yeah.
I just think that your story of your journey was really amazing.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And yeah, I'm glad you clocked that use of the word hijack, because it does feel that way. For many of us, it feels that way. Like, I didn't become more liberal and progressive in spite of my Christian faith. I got here because of my Christian faith. Like, it was actually my desire to follow Jesus more closely, my desire to understand and experience God more intimately is actually what led me more and more to the left. And I will sometimes say, Jesus would have been and likely was accused of being the progressive one in his day. I don't mean progressive as we use the term today. It's a bit anachronistic to say that. But Jesus was clearly asking the current institution to reform, to adapt, to change, to grow, to progress. And it's the same thing that many of us in the progressive movement are doing, asking of the larger church to adapt and to grow and to evolve. Yeah, right here in front.
Okay, so I haven't read all of your book, but
We can wait.
thanks. I will.
No, I'm just kidding.
But I'm curious if you have anything to say from your perspective about transgender people who are on the front line now of being hated by so-called Christians. I mean, the general thing about diversity and loving everybody I get, but I'm wondering if there's anything specific to trans people that you've learned.
Yeah. Thanks for asking that. So in Unclobber, that had, again, very narrow scope, and the scope was just the 6 clobber passages, which really, if we want to say, and as I did, the Bible says nothing about homosexuality, even more obvious is that the Bible says nothing about transgender people. I mean, there's nothing in there that explicitly names that. So no, Unclobber did not address that. But in my new book, which is coming out, there is a whole chapter responding to this idea that conservative Christians will often say, well, God doesn't make mistakes. This is oftentimes their inroad into their sort of anti-trans positioning, is that God doesn't make mistakes. The assumption being whatever your biological sex that you're born with is your gender. Otherwise, you'd be accusing God of making a mistake. And in the book, what I do is I explore this idea of the New Testament word that is often translated as perfect in English. And for instance, you might be familiar with Jesus says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Okay. In pre-Christian thought, in Greek thought, which the New Testament is downstream of so much of Greek thought, Plato and Aristotle disagreed on the concept of perfection. For Plato, to be perfect means there's the ideals, there's the forms, there's the invisible reality of perfection, which is completely unattainable, detached, and separate. And then there's the material physical world, which is imperfect and can only ever be like a shadow of the perfect world. Aristotle says perfection isn't about matching some ideal immaterial form, but perfection is about becoming your full nature of what you really are intended to be. An example would be an acorn. For Plato, an acorn is perfect if it matches the perfect form of an acorn. For Aristotle, the acorn is perfect when it becomes an oak tree. It becomes what it's supposed to be. I think that accusing God of not making mistakes in that way is coming at it from a Platonic way of saying that there is an ideal form that you have to match to be perfect, as opposed to, and this is a very Jewish way of thinking about perfection would be along Aristotle's way of thinking too, that actually the word in Greek that is translated as perfect in English, a more responsible translation of that would be whole or complete. And so I think Jesus is saying, be whole and complete as your Father in heaven is whole or complete. It's not about perfection. It's about becoming who you're intended to be. And so I actually think a lot of trans people in gender studies and in gender science, they talk about gender congruence, which is the experience of lining up your gender, sense of gender identity. And the way that they talk about that is like exactly how the New Testament talks about salvation, in terms of being whole and integrated and finding that sort of alignment. So that's that's what I do in the new book, and I think there's a beautiful road into talking about transgender by going from that way of people becoming who they are intended to be. That is the invitation, not to match some sort of perfect ideal. Yeah.
I enjoyed your talk. I especially enjoyed you talking about the diversity that expanded and exploded around Pentecost.
Yeah.
I've just finished the year of EFM on the history of the church. And so we have this explosion of diversity and inclusion, and then the next 2,000 years of the church is this conformity and exclusion. Just bam, bam, every century.
Yeah.
How do we break that cycle as a people, as followers of the way?
Yeah. You're doing it
luck.
right. You're doing it right now. You're doing it right now. Showing up to this. Those of you who came last night, those of you who are marching in the trans march tomorrow, those of you who are going to be a part. So that's part of how you do it, is you keep showing up. You create the Q+ group that has said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to provide a place where people identify as LGBTQ can just be loved and accepted. And then maybe even if they will want to connect it to their spirituality, then they can feel safe to do that here. Jesus says the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, smallest of seeds, usually overlooked. But like when you plant it, it kind of grows into this bush that just has a way of working its way into everything. It's slow. It takes a while. It's not big and it's not flashy. It's one conversation at a time. It's one relationship at a time. Church history is a fascinating thing to study because you quickly see that Acts 10, Peter, God is teaching me that I must never call another person unclean. And then fast forward a few decades, and I don't begrudge the early Christians for this. And by this I mean creating an institution of Christianity, because that was really the only move they had to make. If you've ever studied the theory of movements, there's 3 outcomes for movements. A movement is when a group of individuals are making demands of an institution saying you need to change, adapt, to grow, here's how you need to evolve. That's what movements are. They push back against institutions. If they succeed and the institution changes and adapts based on the movement's pressure or the movement's work, the movement dissolves and disappears, like it is not needed anymore because the institution actually adapted and changed. What happens when the institution doesn't change or adapt, which is what happened with the early Christians. This is what Jesus was. He's trying to reform Judaism. He wasn't trying to start something new. So the early Christians were like, hey, fellow Jews, the Messiah has come. Like, this is where we need to go. And they said, no, we want none of that. So now movements have 2 options because that didn't work. Option number 1 is if the movement doesn't figure out how to create its own systems, its own structure, its own institution, then it will just fall apart. We saw this happen a number of years ago. Do y'all remember Occupy Wall Street? How's it doing now? It just wasn't clear. It was a movement that made some demands against an institution. Institution's like, yeah, no, we're good. And the movement just kind of fizzled out because it didn't necessarily have anything to create something new, which is the third and final option for a movement, which is to become its own institution, to create something that has structure and system that can outlast itself and that can preserve the demands that preserve its changes. So I don't begrudge the movement of the early church. I know there's a lot of people, I'm not saying you're saying this, a lot of people will look at, for instance, Constantine in the 4th century, declaring the Christianity as the state religion. They'll look at that as just a move of power. Yeah, Also, maybe it's complicated. There's other things in there. They'll look at the canonization of Scripture and they'll be like, oh, it was, why did we include some books and not other books? Well, you have to make choices, and choices were made, and maybe you could question the motivations, or maybe people were doing the best they could. I don't know. All of that's far in the past. My point is over time, humans, we do what we do, which is resort to what we know. We get scared. We feel more comfortable with people who look like us. We feel more comfortable with people who think like us. We turn inward. This is just the pattern of humanity constantly doing that. The way of Jesus is constantly to be pushing against it. And I just don't know that game is ever going to be over. Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. That's kind of depressing on some way. Be like, you're telling me we can never solve that? I don't know. It might just always be a dynamic game, and I don't use that I just use that in a way, like it might always be a dynamic effort of working with the Spirit to disrupt uniformity with diversity. And when it clamps down again, guess what? We show back up again, and we just keep going. We just keep going. So how do we do it? This. You're doing it. You're doing it. And don't give up. Don't give up. By the way, to the allies in the room, to the straight allies like myself, do not give up, okay? We need you in this work. We need you in this work. Part of why I do what I do is because I know that I can put myself out there and I can take. Yeah, do y'all see my favorite book/movie is The Lord of the Rings, and my favorite movie is the first one, Fellowship of the Ring. And do you know that scene at the very end where Boromir has this moment where he succumbs to the desire of power and he tries to grab the ring from Frodo, and Frodo escapes, and then immediately like the scales fall from Boromir's eyes and he realizes what he just did, and then the orcs show up. By the way, did you know you were going to come for a Lord of the Rings talk? And the orcs show up, and suddenly they start to threaten Merry and Pippin, the other two little hobbits, and Boromir, he realizes his one shot at redemption to overcome, I'm going to get weepy just talking about this, his one shot at fixing his error of trying to destroy Frodo and take the ring is to save Merry and Pippin. Do you remember that scene? All the orcs, you see Boromir just taking all these arrows. And that's the image that I get as a straight cisgender person. I'm like, I know that I have layers of privilege, and I can take so many arrows, and I know that one arrow might take the young queer kid behind me, might take him out. One might do it. So I'll just keep on showing up and taking as many as is necessary. And so if you are a straight ally and is here as well, I encourage you to keep showing up to this. Keep showing up. Yeah, we've got down here Lou in front. Whew, we started with the earthquake in Lisbon. We ended with hobbits. What a night. What a time to be alive.
I'm Lou, and I have allergies. But I've been a Methodist my whole life, as I told you. And being straight ally, what you just said, I mean, we have been through this fight with disaffiliation the last few years with the United Methodist Church. Yeah. We had people leave our church who were gay, who said, we don't want to fight it anymore. We can't fight it. We all continue to fight. We got ourselves elected to be the people who would go to annual conference in Hot Springs with the United Methodist Church to vote for the people that we knew who were straight allies, who believed that contradictory language should be removed from the Book of Discipline that said Christianity is not compatible, or homosexuality is not compatible to Christianity. We voted for the people in those meetings who believed like we did, who knew that needed to change. And through that, disaffiliation came. But that's what we said, we'll fight this fight for y'all. Yeah. You don't have to, we're going to do it for you. Yeah. And today we have a United Methodist Church that is splintered, but the ones who stayed are right here with our LGBTQ
That's how you do
friends.
It. That's how you do it. And Lou, it's stories like this and it's nights like this that give me immense optimism for the future. when I don't have my phone on me. When I look at my phone, when I open up news or social media, which I do less and less anymore, you can find 100 reasons to despair. You can immediately be convinced the world's going to hell in a handbasket. You can just, cynicism is easy. But when I travel the country, which I do 100 days a year, I am out on the road doing this work. Which, by the way, let me quickly say that if there are any people in this room that would like to support this work that I do, I have some brochures in the back. I've got a nonprofit called the Unclobber Initiative, and the goal is to educate and resource individuals and churches for better beliefs around inclusion. And so if that's a ministry that you would like to support and help me to do this work, I would love to partner with you in that. So please take a brochure. But when I travel and I do this, if I look online, I despair. If I look at real human beings, I'm like, no, we're okay. We're actually better than okay. We're good. This Titanic ship is moving, and it's going to take a while. Right now, as best as I can tell, less than 10% of the churches in America are affirming. And that's just America. When you go global, that number drastically reduces. But in America, less than 10% of churches are affirming, which means there's a lot of work to do still. And what I like to invite progressives to do is every once in a while turn around, because we get so forward-facing. Here's where we got to fix things. Here's what's not working. Here's where we can get better. All that's true. Every once in a while, turn around and see that. Remember the progress we've made. Remember that 5-10 years ago, 20 years ago. You know how many churches were affirmed? What that number was? 40 years ago. I will save some of you from going even decades farther back. We've made a lot of progress. We've made a lot, and that is just only getting bigger. That is only getting better. That is only improving. And I see it when I come and I travel to places like Fayetteville, Arkansas, and I see you give up your Thursday nights to come and be a part of this. So, yeah, thank you. Thank you. We got time for one more?
I'm a gay ally. My name is Paul. And one of the things I want to say, apropos of your comments, is one of the purposes that's intentional of empire is to colonize the corporate consciousness so what they condemn becomes common sense. So if the corporate consciousness that's been colonized by empire is it's wrong, it's bad, it's not good to do this, then communities like this are essential, not just for support, but also for resistance and to name reality in a way that is, as you've done tonight, more inclusive. So I'm glad to be a part of this, and I feel like as a retired Presbyterian pastor, I'm doing what God wants me to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Do we have one more question? Yeah, right here.
So I noticed that you're talking about 3 of the future things, those different topics. Do you have any thoughts on what Jesus commands us to do, which is to love your neighbor as yourself?
Do I have any thoughts on what Jesus calls us to do? Is that the question? Yes. For a moment, let's pretend James didn't say, do you have any thoughts on what Jesus would do? And love for a moment, ignore that James said, love your neighbor as yourself. Scrub that from your memory. Okay? Now back up. And just say, do you have any thoughts on what Jesus would do? Say that. Do you have any thoughts on what Jesus would do? Do you have any thoughts on what Jesus would have us do? Just say that part. Oh, great question, James. So I often, when I read the Gospels, I get so bummed out because I think people only had access to Jesus for a short time. His public ministry was very brief. By best accounts, maybe 3 years. And we don't have anything written down from him. All we have are our accounts and eyewitness accounts and the things that he said. And I just wish that during that brief window of time when we had the express image of God, as Hebrews calls him, the exact representation of God in flesh, I wish someone would have taken advantage of the moment to say, Jesus, what's the most important thing? I wish it would have solved so many problems. It would have alleviated so much confusion if just someone would have asked, Jesus, what's the most important thing? And obviously the punchline is, oh wait, someone did ask him that. Someone asked, what's the most important thing? And Jesus gave an answer. He didn't answer too many questions directly. A lot of times he would respond to questions with questions. A lot of times he would respond to questions with parables or confusing things. Go and learn what this means. This question, he just straight up answered. Oh, you want to know the most important thing? Believe in the Trinity. That wasn't the answer. What's the most important thing? Jesus says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. These two sum up everything. That's it. It really is it. What originally began as a movement organized around love has devolved into believe the right things, sadly. So what does Jesus invite us to do? It is as simple as love. I'm not saying love is easy, but it is that simple. It was so simple that people were so offended that was Jesus' answer that they ultimately killed him for it. Or they asked follow-up questions. What's the most important thing? Love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, but who's my neighbor? Again, where's the loophole? It can't be as simple as just love. But what if it is? What if that really is the most important thing? Well, don't we got to get people to believe something? Nope, don't worry about that. Love. It really is love. That's it. That's it. It really is love. So that's why I was like, you spoiled the punchline. But also it was perfect. So thank you, James. It's a great way to end, because that really is the invitation from me as best as I can, being a conduit for God, is to say that our call is simply to love. That's it. And let God handle everything else. Let God, as the author of faith, let God handle everything else. You're just called to love. You do that, you can't lose. Always trust love. Always trust love. It never fails.
I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
Okay. I know you're going to be here Sunday morning
I will be, yes.
at Adult Forum, and you know we're having this big picnic on Saturday. And we also have a group that are going to be marching in the parade, and we would love if you would consider to walk down to Dixon with our group.
On Saturday?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's why I'm here.
Okay.
I flew all the way here to be with you. So yes, of course. I just don't think I brought sunscreen, so if you can provide me with sunscreen.
We'll make sure you have
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to head back to the back. I'd love to meet you. Please come say hi. Please come buy a book. I'll sign books. I'd love to come. But thank you so much for coming. Anything else, Vicki, or is that it?
No, that's it.
All right, thank you.